Thank you very much, Dr. Sosa. And I have to say, I am beyond privileged to be part of this discussion today. If I could handpick colleagues that I could listen to learn some of these lessons, it would be many of the people that are here. And I just want to be thankful for that as we start. I don't have anything to disclose except that I'm very much a learner about these things myself, and I don't want to share what I share in a spirit of expertise, but in a spirit of learning together with you. As I looked at the objectives for this session, I thought about these themes of thinking about crisis, thinking about what's now a chronic crisis for all of us, thinking about failure as the crucible that fuels the growth of leaders, and thinking about what personal stories I could bring from my experience this past year that might illustrate in a way unique to the experience we've each had, but for me personally, what I learned, including in the areas of vulnerability and learning from failure. Much of what I share will be the story that I went through as chair of the board of directors for the American Board of Surgery this past year. So I began that term in June of 2020, end of June. We as an organization, as many of you know, had just completed a major governance redesign for the organization. We were socializing that with key constituent and stakeholder groups. We had our written exam for the recent graduates, 1,400 of them waiting to take the exam coming up in mid-July. We had to make a decision 3 months before that about what we were going to do. People planned their lives around the event. It was clear we could not give it in our usual format in secure centers, and we made a proactive decision to commit to trying to offer it in a virtual platform. There was no off-the-shelf way to do that, so there was a lot of work to prepare for that. We had fiscal pressures for the organization linked to a defined benefits plan for retirees that had been in place for decades and that we were just beginning to wade into the details of as the stock market had not performed as anticipated. Our diplomats were in the middle of the crisis of managing the pandemic, especially in places like New York City. Our candidates had had truncated operative experiences during their residency that we'd had to make adjustments to. And racism and healthcare disparities were becoming headline news in our national debates. And in that context, I started my year as chair. You all know what happened with our written exam, a virtual proctoring strategy that we entrusted to a company we had not had to work with before, but had good references on. And I don't mean to say any of this in a way to critique someone else, but to talk about our responsibility. Failed miserably. It even got into concerns that candidates' own personal information might have been compromised through electronic tools that were used in trying to help sort out the problems that arose as the exam was delivered. And these were some of the headlines from various medical and business newsletters that came out. Words like nightmare, failure, backlash, and the question of security issues for our vulnerable candidates themselves. The response on Twitter was the kind of thing that tears your heart. If you're in a position of stewardship and responsibility with an organization, stories about saving money, buying computers, spouses taking the rest of their time off to be able to get the kids delivered somewhere so someone could sit the exam, and questions for us as a board about negligence, integrity, and leadership. That was the first 2 weeks of my year as chair of the board. Just a day or two after the exam failure, we met as a board virtually, and I was trying to find a way to put a handle on this for us as a group. And some of you have read Eric Larson's book, The Splendid and the Vile, about Churchill's first year as prime minister, as the Nazi blitzkrieg and bombing raids came down on the British. And they really, at that point, had very little they could do in defense. This is the only picture in the book, for those of you who haven't read it. It's in the front. And to me, it captures what leaders must do in times of crisis. You see a bombed out library. Remarkably, the book stands are still intact with the roof gone and rubble everywhere. The powerful thing is that Churchill was able to persuade the British people to respond by going about their business and not caving in to the pressures of what they were encountering. And here are 3 British men in their top coats and derbies, leisurely more or less, picking out the books that they want to read. And we shared as a group together amidst tears and fears and concerns and a sense of failure that this is what we had to find a way to do, to carry on, to do our job, to not cave in, and to think about how we could not compound our errors as we went forward. Many of the things I would share personally from that experience, Julianne has already touched on, and others I'm sure are going to comment on. I won't enumerate all of them, but I think personally I found it was very important to establish ownership, to take responsibility, as Dr. Sosa just said, to communicate and to put your emphasis on listening. Some of those early calls with candidates and webinars were so informative and so helpful, and a chance for us to show genuine regret, sympathy, and a commitment in a timely way to try to reverse the failure in a way that honored our commitment to those folks. To be finding yourself in a place of humility and teachability, when it came to questions of what you really had to do and what to prioritize, to ask who it was that you must serve and what priority that lent to any other decisions you were making. Not always seeking to do the best thing, but trying always to do the right thing, if I can frame it that way. Because many times in failure, optimal outcomes aren't available to us, but making the right next step can be critical to the ultimate outcome. Having safe places, again, as Dr. Sosa has already highlighted, to process, and thinking about how to elevate others and taking care of one another, and quite honestly for me, finding spiritual resources to face what was one of the deeper crises and probably the biggest public relations crisis the board had encountered in its history, or at least perhaps so. Well, out of that can come opportunity, and we had an amazing team. You know, many of you know the other people on the board, and that was critical to the success and the turnaround and the changes. And I won't enumerate again all of these, but I will tell you, as many of you know, that by July this past month, and most of the ones that waited till then wanted to wait till July, the rest were caught up in April. We caught up everybody who lost their opportunity to take the qualifying exam. We developed a virtual certifying exam platform, and everyone was caught up on that by June. We survived the fiscal threats, and in some ways, like many of your organizations, actually found some fiscal opportunities and decreased travel and other expenses. We were able to see some key publications come out. I'll share the headlines of those on the next slide, and really lean into some new things that I think have great potential for the board to move in a positive direction, like looking at video-based assessment as a formative tool for really assessing and growing and coaching towards improved technical skills for surgeons, both in training and in practice, focusing on outcomes, socializing, and I talked about this in our talk yesterday, so I won't belabor it here, but a whole new approach to how we populate the board in a competency and diversity-driven way, and leaning into the themes of anti-racism as an organization, not in a pontificating way, but looking inward at ourselves and what we needed to change. A couple of the publications that came out of some of that introspection and reflection on trying to be sure we were focusing on what's important were the first paper in the board community that showed a correlation between board certification and better patient outcomes, specifically with colectomy in early career providers. And some reflective pieces presented at the ASA and published in Annals on the outcomes and what we learned from having to switch to a virtual exam format. I briefly mentioned racism and talked a lot about this yesterday, but I just want to highlight the contributions of 2 members of the board of directors. Paris Butler in the lower right was on the board with me, and John Stewart replaced my seat on the board when I rotated off. Of the 13 board members now, board of directors members, 6 are women, 2 are black men. It's a remarkable difference from the pictures you've seen of our board in 1937. And opportunities to collaborate with other organizations such as the college as they leaned into these things and led with thought leadership and platforms to discuss these issues that were also powerful. If you look at our new counselors for the board, it's a much more diverse-looking group than the board of directors of the American Board of Surgery in 1937. Again, I highlighted yesterday Andrea Hayes Jordan, who's in the upper left in that picture, newly named department chair at Howard. And in July, Kay Marie King was named department chair, as many of you know, I'm sure, at Albany. First 2 black women to be chairs of departments of surgery. So the crisis can lead us to points where we can learn and make change that leads us in a very positive direction. So I'll just conclude with this. I found very much through this experience that leadership involves an inward as well as an outward journey, that it transforms us as we work with our organizations to transform and not just transact the challenging paths ahead of us. That failure and challenge are the crucible in which those journeys are leveraged and accelerated, and that our hearts are exposed and defined, and in many cases we gain opportunities for correction and growth we wouldn't otherwise have from such experiences. And I shared again this yesterday, but the quote that became most important to me over the course of the year was this one from Max Dupree. The first responsibility of the leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you. In between, the leader is a servant and a debtor. Thank you.